It is just after 3 o'clock in the morning. June 17th, 1944. The island of Saipan, in the Mariana chain of the Central Pacific, smells of cordite, diesel smoke, and salt air carried in on a warm southern wind. The darkness is dense and thick, the kind of tropical night that presses against the skin like a wet cloth, swallowing sound and light in equal measure. Somewhere in the jungle beyond the marine lines, something stirs, something heavy, something mechanical, something that grinds and clanks and shudders against the red volcanic earth with the weight of iron conviction. The men in the foxholes hear it before they see it. A sound like kitchenware dragged across stone, a sound like a machine grumbling in its sleep. And then, through the blackness, the shapes appear, low and angular and moving with a purposeful momentum that no single infantryman alone could oppose. They are tanks, 44 of them, the last real armored thrust that Imperial Japan would ever launch in the Pacific War, and they are heading straight for the American lines. In the lead vehicle, a Type 97 Chiha medium tank, a colonel named Takashi Goto stands erect in his open turret. He lifts a cavalry saber above his head, a gesture older than the machine he commands, and brings it down flat against the steel hull with a sound that rings out like a temple bell. The other tank commanders follow suit, saber against iron, in that brief moment of ceremony before the charge. Then the hatches close, then the engines surge, then the darkness swallows the column whole. What those men inside those machines believed, what they had been trained to believe, so what they had been conditioned since childhood and every hour of military service to trust with absolute certainty, was that inside the riveted skin of the Type 97 Chiha they were invulnerable. They were encased in steel, sealed from the world of flesh and bone and soft American fear. Whatever was waiting in the darkness ahead of them, it could not reach them here. Not through this armor, not through this iron faith. They were wrong, and the weapon that proved it to them, a simple steel tube roughly the length of a man's leg, launched from the shoulder of a single Marine lying in a foxhole, would become one of the defining instruments of the Pacific War. To understand why that night on Saipan mattered so profoundly, and why the shock of what the bazooka did to the Chiha's armor reverberated far beyond the smoking wreckage that littered the fields at dawn, one must go back further. One must go back to the factories of Mitsubishi. One must go back to the continent of China. One must go back to the ideology that built the Chiha and the civilization that built the bazooka, and understand the vast philosophical distance that separated them. The Type 97 Chiha was not designed for war against the United States of America. That fact, forgotten now in the heat of retrospective analysis, is essential to grasping every strategic miscalculation that followed its deployment in the Pacific. It was designed in 1937, refined through 1938, and rolled off the Mitsubishi assembly lines at a steady but measured pace throughout the early years of the conflict. Yet it weighed approximately 13.5 metric tons, carried a four-man crew, commander, gunner, bow machine gunner who doubled as radio operator and driver, and was armed in its original configuration with a low-velocity 57mm Type 97 gun that was never intended to fight enemy armor. It was an infantry support weapon, a mobile artillery piece for clearing Chinese positions, suppressing static defenses, and providing a spearhead for foot soldiers who would otherwise have to advance on dug-in positions without cover. Against the armies of China, the Chiha was effective. Against poorly armed, often undersupplied Chinese nationalist and regional forces in the late 1930s and early 1940s, a tank with 25mm of armor at its thickest point and a low-muzzle velocity infantry support gun represented a fearsome technological advantage. As the battlefield was defined by that disparity, Japanese tankers who fought along the rivers and plains of Manchuria and coastal China carried with them a lived experience of armored dominance, a memory encoded through repetition and survival that told them, again and again, that the steel hull around them was proof enough against almost anything the enemy could bring to bear. There had been one warning, one moment when the machine had been tested against a real industrial opponent and found to be desperately lacking. In the summer of 1939, along the remote Khalkhin-Gol River on the Mongolian-Manchurian border, Japanese armor clashed with the armored forces of the Soviet Union in what history records as the Battle of Nomonhan. The result was catastrophic for Imperial Japan. Soviet BT-7 tanks, faster and better armed, destroyed Japanese Type 89 and Type 94 tankettes with systematic, almost contemptuous efficiency. Japanese infantrymen who witnessed the engagement later described running headlong into Soviet armor with incendiary bottles, satchel charges, and hand-thrown grenades, anything to slow the advance. One Japanese survivor recalled years later the sight of his countrymen crushed beneath the advancing treads like so many insects under a boot. The fighting was hell, he said, not figuratively, literally hell, where the earth itself seemed to burn and the machines moved through it without mercy. Nomonhan should have forced a fundamental rethinking of Japanese armor doctrine. It should have prompted urgent investment in heavier plate, more powerful guns, and a genuine industrial commitment to tank production comparable to that of the major European powers. The lesson was available. The evidence was undeniable. But the lessons of Nomonhan were largely suppressed within the imperial military hierarchy, deemed politically inconvenient, filed away in the institutional memory under the heading of anomaly rather than precedent. The Japanese army emerged from Nomonhan shaken but ideologically intact. The Chiha continued to roll off the Mitsubishi lines largely unchanged. The armor remained at 25 millimeters. The doctrine remained infantry support, and the faith in the machine endured. Japan built approximately 2,123 Type 97 Chiha tanks between 1938 and 1943. In the entire period from 1931 to 1945, all Japanese manufacturers combined produced barely 6,500 tanks of every type, from the lightest reconnaissance vehicle to the heaviest experimental prototype. It is a number that, when placed beside the output of the American industrial machine, ceases to be a statistic and becomes instead a kind of historical verdict. Because by the end of the war, American factories had produced more than 86,000 tanks. Not counting armored cars, not counting half-tracks, not counting the tens of thousands of artillery pieces and millions of rifles and the 2 million trucks and the 300,000 aircraft that rolled and flew off American production lines at a pace that Japanese military planners, when confronted with the actual figures late in the war, often found literally incomprehensible. At one point during the Pacific Campaign, Japanese prisoners of war in Nebraska were brought to witness an American combine harvester working a wheat field at full operation, the enormous machine consuming the grain in long mechanical sweeps. Several of the prisoners, men who had been raised on the self-sustaining logic of Japanese military mythology, stared at the machine in silence for a long moment before one of them said quietly that he had initially assumed it must be a weapon of some kind. Nothing else, in his experience, was built on that scale. Nothing else moved with that confident, indifferent efficiency. The American industrial system was not merely a military advantage. It was an expression of a particular civilization's values, a civilization built on abundance, on the principle that a free people with access to raw materials, capital, and incentive could manufacture their way to solutions that purely martial cultures, constrained by ideology and hierarchy and the limitations of command economies, could not imagine. The United States in 1942 was not prepared for war in the conventional sense. Its standing army was modest, its tanks were largely obsolete, its doctrine was incomplete. But what it possessed, in a measure so far beyond the comprehension of its enemies that the disparity itself became a kind of weapon, was capacity. The capacity to learn, adapt, and produce on a scale that turned every technological deficiency into a temporary inconvenience. That capacity gave the world the bazooka. In the spring of 1942, a United States Army Ordnance officer named Colonel Leslie Skinner received a directive to develop a new handheld anti-tank weapon capable of being operated by a single infantryman. The problem it needed to solve was both immediate and urgent. American forces had already encountered German tank formations in North Africa, and the existing anti-tank options available to frontline infantry, the rifle grenade, the anti-tank mine, the 37-millimeter gun, required either proximity so dangerous as to be suicidal or equipment so heavy and cumbersome that it could not keep pace with a fast-moving armored assault. What was needed was a weapon that one man, or at most two, could carry into a foxhole and fire from the shoulder at a tank, passing 30 or 40 yards away, yet with a realistic expectation of penetrating the armor and killing the machine. Colonel Skinner, working with fellow ordnance engineer Lieutenant Edward Ewell, arrived at a solution built around a physics principle first documented by Charles Edward Munro in 1885. The Munro effect, sometimes called the shaped charge effect, describes what happens when an explosive is hollowed into a concave geometry and detonated against a metal surface. Rather than dispersing energy unidirectionally in the conventional manner of an explosion, the shaped charge focuses its released energy into a concentrated, at high-velocity jet of superplastic metal and gas that punches through armor not by kinetic brute force, but by thermodynamic precision. A stream of destruction so concentrated and so fast that it can penetrate steel several times thicker than the diameter of the explosive itself. Skinner and Ewell placed this warhead on the nose of a small rocket, wrapped it in a steel tube 60 millimeters in diameter, and affixed a pair of electrical contacts to the barrel. When the trigger was pressed and the circuit closed, the rocket motor ignited and the round traveled downrange at moderate velocity toward its target. It did not need speed. Speed was irrelevant. The armor penetration was achieved not by the force of impact but by the detonation of the shaped charge at the moment of contact, a distinction that made the weapon fundamentally different from every previous handheld anti-armor device in military history. A rifle-launched grenade depended on kinetic energy and fragmentation. The bazooka's rocket warhead was something older and more elemental, focused fire, shaped into a needle by the logic of physics. The complete system weighed roughly 13 pounds and could be carried by a single soldier. In June 1942, the first production model, designated the rocket launcher M1, entered service. Its shaped charge warhead could penetrate approximately 3 to 4 inches, 75 to 100 millimeters, of homogeneous rolled steel armor plate. That number, measured in inches, may not sound like much, but measured against the armor of the Type 97 Chiha, 25 millimeters at its very thickest, 20 millimeters along the hull sides, as little as 8 millimeters along the bottom. The bazooka's penetration capability was not merely sufficient. It was absolute. The bazooka could punch through the Chiha's armor at the front. It could punch through at the sides. It could punch through at the rear. It could, in some circumstances, punch through from above. There was no angle of approach, no orientation of the vehicle, no tactical repositioning that the Chiha could adopt that would bring its armor into a range of protection that the bazooka's warhead could not defeat. The tankers inside that machine were not protected. They had never been protected, not from this weapon. They simply did not know it yet. As the weapon made its operational debut in North Africa on November 8, 1942, during Operation Torch, the Anglo-American landings on the coast of French Morocco and Algeria. Its performance there was mixed against the heavier German tank designs, which in some configurations carried frontal armor that reached into ranges where the early M1 Bazooka's penetration was marginal or insufficient. The Germans, characteristically thorough in their study of captured enemy equipment, examined the weapon and were so impressed by the fundamental concept that they developed their own version, a substantially larger, more powerful device they designated the Panzerschreck, within months of first encountering it. It was, in the military historian's phrase, the sincerest form of flattery, the enemy taking your technology and enlarging it. Yet, but in the Pacific, the bazooka did not face Tiger tanks or Panthers. It faced the Chi-Ha. The M1 and its improved successor, the M1A1, arrived in the Pacific theater in 1943. By the time Operation Forager, the campaign to seize the Mariana Islands, was being planned in early 1944, Marine anti-tank units had been trained, equipped, and integrated with bazooka teams at the squad and platoon level. The improved M9A1 variant, which broke down into two parts for easier transport through dense jungle and over coral ridges, was formally adopted in June of 1944, arriving in theater just as the largest armored engagement of the entire Pacific War was drawing near. The 2.36-inch rocket with its M6 heat warhead was, by this point, a known quantity to the Marines who carried it. They knew what it could do to light Japanese armor, that they had tested it. They had trained with it. What they did not yet know was whether it would hold up in the chaos of a night attack against 44 tanks rolling out of the dark simultaneously in the context of a desperate Japanese counterstroke designed to push the entire American beachhead back into the sea. On the night of June 15, 1944, the very first hours after the Marine landing on Saipan, the Japanese tried a preliminary probe with a handful of the unusual Type II Kami amphibious tanks. The Marine platoons along the waterline had been briefed to expect anything from the sea, and when the odd, ungainly machines appeared in the surf zone, a private first class of the 1st Platoon, Company F, had raised his head above the waterline and reportedly called back to his lieutenant that the enemy had arrived from Garapan with the kitchen sink. 2 of those amphibious tanks were destroyed at the front of the Marine lines by bazooka teams. The 3rd broke through and was run down within 75 yards of a regimental command post where it was finally killed. The joke was grim and the danger was real, but the night ended with the bazooka's account intact. What came next was different in scale. Altogether different. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, commanding the Japanese 43rd Division on Saipan, understood by the evening of June 16th that the American beachhead was consolidating. Every hour that passed, more men came ashore, more supplies piled on the beaches. More artillery tubes were unlimbered and registered on the interior ridgelines. If there was ever a moment to break the beachhead, to hurl the invaders back into the Philippine Sea before they could anchor themselves on the island, that moment was now. Saito ordered an attack with every tank and every infantryman he could assemble. He drafted his order in the direct, unambiguous language of a commander who understood that he was wagering everything on a single roll of the dice. The wording that reached his subordinate commanders was translated and captured in American military records. Destroy the enemy during the night at the water's edge. Colonel Takashi Goto assembled the remnants of his 9th Tank Regiment. In total, 44 tanks were committed to the assault. Elements of the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th Companies, along with 6 headquarters vehicles, the maximum concentration of armor Japan had ever launched against American forces in the Pacific War. Among them were both the original Chi-Ha variant, armed with its low-velocity 57mm infantry support gun, and the improved Shinhoto Chi-Ha, carrying the higher-velocity 47mm Type I anti-tank gun that could, at close range and from favorable angles, threaten even the M4 Sherman. Infantry from the 136th Infantry Regiment were loaded onto the tanks, some clinging to crude bamboo frameworks hastily welded to the engine decks, others packed into tight clusters around the turrets. The column moved out. The Marines heard them before they saw them. The sound was described by multiple witnesses as a squeal and rattle of treads over volcanic rock, so audible above the normal sounds of battle even from the vicinity of the regimental command post. Captain Clark Rowland, forward with his company, passed the assessment up the chain of command with the characteristic brevity of a man who had already decided what to do. It sounded, he said, like a night attack coming. He requested illumination from the Navy ships offshore. The warships answered with star shells. Dozens of them. The darkness above the Japanese column broke open into a cold white daylight that suspended the tree line in shadowless clarity. And in that sudden light, the Marines saw them. Tank after tank, low and gray-green and grinding forward at the pace of a determined walk, turrets slewing in search of targets, infantry clinging to every flat surface, as the whole procession emerging from the jungle as if the island itself were birthing machines. The anti-tank teams fired. The first rockets crossed the open ground in fractions of a second. The shaped charges detonated against the Chiha's frontal plate, 25 millimeters of riveted steel, the thickest armor the vehicle carried, and punched through. Flames appeared in the vision slits. A turret stopped rotating. A tank veered sideways, struck a low earthen berm, and stalled. Others kept coming. More rockets were fired. The 37mm anti-tank guns on the flanks engaged at close range, their flat reports mixing with the deeper detonations of bazooka hits and the continuous mechanical stammer of .30 caliber Browning machine guns working at the infantry between the tanks. Yet the 75mm pack howitzers of the 10th Marines fired over 800 rounds in the space of the engagement, working in direct fire mode against a target they could see by the light of burning vehicles. One battery of 105mm howitzers exhausted its entire available ammunition supply before the night was over. The fighting was not clean. It was not a surgical engagement between weapons systems operating at designed parameters. It was, in the words of the official Marine Corps history, a madhouse of noise, tracers, and flashing lights. Tanks broke through platoon lines and were engaged from behind by reserve teams. Japanese infantry, stripped from the tank hulls by machine gun fire, moved between burning vehicles and fired small arms at foxholes they could not quite locate. Some Chiha commanders, yes, their guides shot off the tank decks in the opening minutes, lost direction, and wandered in slow circles in the swampy ground between the Marine positions, absorbing hit after hit from multiple weapons until the steel glowed and the interior could sustain life no longer. One Marine private first class, Herbert Hodges, a bazooka man embedded with the forward platoons as the Corps doctrine then prescribed, engaged 7 Type 97 tanks in succession that night. 7. With a weapon designed for a 2-man crew, 1 man aiming and firing, 1 man loading, Hodges operated largely alone in the confusion, cycling through rockets at a rate that left the brass still hot in the loading end of his tube as each new round went in. A second Marine, whose name was not prominently recorded in the available unit histories, but whose actions were documented in after-action reports, destroyed 4 tanks with his bazooka before his ammunition was spent, then disabled a 5th Chiha with a hand grenade thrown at the track assembly from a distance that left him close enough to feel the heat of the burning vehicle on his face. The records are clear. Of the 44 tanks Colonel Goto committed to the assault that night, 31 were destroyed before dawn. Only 1 tank escaped entirely intact. The last was spotted at first light climbing a road toward Hill 790, its turret visible among a cluster of buildings at the summit. A naval gunfire officer adjusted his ship's guns, fired 20 salvos onto the coordinates, and watched the oily black smoke rise above the ridgeline for the rest of the day. The burning wrecks of Goto's regiment, caught by the rising sun of June 17, 1944, were distributed across a field roughly the size of several city blocks. Some had been hit so many times by so many different weapons, bazooka rockets, 37mm rounds, 75mm shells, 105mm howitzers, that it was impossible to determine afterward which strike had been the killing blow. One Marine Corps history noted with a kind of weary factual precision that more than one Marine from more than one unit often claimed the destruction of a single vehicle. The important thing, the report concluded, was that the means available were adequate for the task. That sentence, spare and bureaucratic in its phrasing, contains within it the entire strategic equation of the Pacific War. The means were adequate. They had always been adequate. The Chiha's armor was not proof against the American bazooka from any direction. The front held no safety. The sides offered no sanctuary. The rear was no retreat. The turret roof above the crew's heads was no ceiling of protection. In the language of armor design, the Chiha had been penetrated, not by velocity, not by a massed salvo of artillery, by a tube carried by a single Marine that could be operated by one exhausted young man in a muddy foxhole in the dark. There is a diary entry that was found among the wreckage of the Saipan battlefield. It was written by a Japanese tanker who had survived the night, who had not been part of Goto's charge, who sat in the aftermath and counted what remained. His words, translated and preserved in American military archives, carry the weight of a man reckoning with a truth his training had never prepared him to receive. "The remaining tanks in our regiment make a total of 12, he wrote. "Even if there are no tanks, we will fight hand to hand. I have resolved that if I see the enemy, I will take out my sword and slash, slash, slash at him as long as I last, thus ending my life of 24 years. Read those words slowly. There is no complaint in them, no bitterness, no expression of betrayal toward the machine that had failed to protect his comrades. There is only the substitution of one weapon for another. The tank replaced by the sword, the mechanical age giving way to the feudal in the space of a single sentence. He was 24 years old. He had been trained to believe that the steel of his vehicle was a form of destiny. When that destiny failed, he reached for the next available symbol of his code, the sword, the oldest Japanese military metaphor. As if the problem were not strategic, but philosophical, not a failure of armor design, but an insufficient commitment of spirit. That is what ideology does to soldiers. It does not merely alter their tactics. It alters the questions they are permitted to ask. The Japanese tanker in that diary could not write. The armor was too thin. He could not write, "We should have built better machines." He could not write, "The Americans had a weapon that we failed to account for, and the fault belongs to those who sent us here in Chihas against men carrying bazookas." He could only write about the sword, because the sword was the answer that his culture had prepared for every question, and including the ones it had not anticipated. The bazooka was something different. It was the answer to a question that a free industrial democracy had asked itself in 1942 and answered with assembly lines, with physics laboratories, with the collective ingenuity of a nation that rewarded the man who solved a problem rather than the man who suffered it most stoically. Colonel Skinner and Lieutenant Ewell were not samurai. They were ordnance engineers working in a government office in Washington. They were asked to solve a problem, and they solved it, using the Monroe effect and a steel tube and an electrical ignition system and a production line that turned out approximately 800,000 complete launcher units before the war ended. 800,000, against Japan's 6,500 tanks of all types. The arithmetic of those numbers is not merely a military statistic. It is a statement about what kind of civilization wins a war of industrial attrition over the long arc of history. The pattern that played out on Saipan in the early hours of June 17, 1944, was not unique to that island. It was the crystallized expression of a truth that had been forming since the earliest encounters between Japanese armor and American weaponry in the Pacific. On Guadalcanal in October 1942, the very first major engagement of Japanese tanks against American Marines, 9 Type 97 Chiha medium tanks were sent against the Marine perimeter at the Matanikau River. They were met with 37mm anti-tank guns and howitzer fire. Every one was destroyed. The lessons should have been visible then, in the smoking iron wreckage scattered along that riverbank on the 23rd of October, 1942. The Chiha was not a survivor of modern anti-tank fire. It had never been designed to be. It was a machine built for fighting Chinese infantry in the 1930s, and when it met the anti-tank weapons of the American military-industrial complex, the encounter was brief and one-directional. On Peleliu, in September 1944, Japanese tanks were again committed against Marine positions and again met with bazookas, 37mm guns, and Sherman tank fire. The Marine history of that battle records infantry employing heavy-caliber weapons and bazookas alongside resident armor to repulse and destroy Japanese armored thrusts in fighting that was confused, brutal, and set against terrain that gave the defenders every natural advantage. The Chiha's armor, in every engagement, in every theater of the Pacific, at every range and angle, was never equal to what waited for it. On Luzon, in the Philippines, in early 1945, Japan's 2nd Tank Division was committed in what amounted to the last major Japanese armored operation of the Pacific War. The division fielded approximately 220 tanks, 175 Type 97 Shinhoto Chiha medium tanks, and 25 Type 95 Hago light tanks, the most powerful concentration of Japanese armor ever assembled in a single operational formation in the Pacific theater. They faced Sherman tanks, artillery, bazookas, and the combined arms doctrine that American commanders had been refining since Guadalcanal. By March 5, 1945, the 2nd Tank Division had been virtually annihilated. The photographs from the Umingan area of Luzon show Chiha hulls distributed along roadsides and in drainage ditches, some upended, some with turrets blown free, some with multiple penetrations clearly visible in the steel plate where shaped charges had done their work, at angles the designers had never imagined would matter. The Shinhoto Chiha, the most powerful variant of the type, carried armor upgraded slightly over the original, the turret cheeks reaching 26mm, the hull front reaching a similar figure. It was still less than 1 1/10 inches of steel. The M1 Bazooka's warhead, penetrating at a consistent 75 to 100mm regardless of angle, remained more than adequate at every range at which the engagement took place. There was no version of the Chiha that outran the bazooka's penetration. Yet not the early model, not the improved Shinhoto, not the theoretically more powerful variants that Japan was developing late in the war, but never deployed in numbers. The armor gap was not a technical anomaly that a new design revision might close. It was structural. It was ideological. It was the physical manifestation of a nation that had chosen to fight a modern industrial war with pre-modern industrial assumptions about what steel and spirit could accomplish against an enemy who was measuring the same problem in physics laboratories and answering it in factories that ran 24 hours a day. Consider for a moment the C-ration tin, small enough to fit in a jacket pocket, sealed against weather and humidity by a crimped metal lid, stenciled with contents in plain military type. And it contained roughly 3,400 calories across 3 cans per day: biscuits, canned meat, soluble coffee, sugar, cigarettes, a small accessory pack of toilet paper, and can opener. It was not delicious food. American soldiers complained about it endlessly, catalogued its deficiencies with the practiced thoroughness that a free people bring to any subject about which they feel entitled to have an opinion. But it existed. It reached the soldier. On nearly every island in the Pacific, on nearly every day of the campaign, the tin arrived. Not always on time, not always warm, but it arrived with the same institutional certainty as the ammunition and the replacement parts and the medical supplies, because the system that produced it, the same vast, unromantic, a democratic industrial system that produced the bazooka and the Sherman tank and the B-29 Superfortress, did not run on spirit or on the force of ideology. It ran on logistics, on capital, on the organized labor of millions of American workers who went to factories every morning and performed specific functions in specific sequences because they were paid to do so. because the economy incentivized their participation, because the democratic contract between citizen and state had always included the implicit promise that the state would organize the material world in a manner that rewarded productive participation. Japanese soldiers in the last years of the Pacific War were eating bark, not metaphorically. The survivors of Saipan's final defensive phase, trapped in the northern hills with no resupply possible, stripped trees of their bark and boiled it. Japanese prisoners taken late in the Philippine campaigns described ration levels that had fallen to fractions of what the human body required for sustained combat effectiveness. The supply chain of Imperial Japan, starved by American submarine warfare, compressed by the loss of island after island, stretched past breaking point across the width of the Pacific, could not match what the American system delivered as a matter of routine to every Marine rifleman in every foxhole on every island from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima. The sea ration tin, passed from hand to hand in a Marine foxhole on the night of June 17, 1944, as the last of Goto's tanks burned themselves down to cooling iron in the field beyond the perimeter. That tin was not merely food, and it was a message from the civilization that sent the Marine to that island. It said, "We will not run out." It said, "The machine behind you is larger than the machine in front of you." It said, "Every resource you consume will be replaced, because the system producing them operates at a scale your enemy has never built and can never match, because we chose, as a people, to build a society in which individual ingenuity and industrial capacity were the primary expressions of national strength, rather than the secondary considerations to military spirit." Goto's soldiers had spirit. They had the kind of spirit that opens a turret hatch in the dark and waves a saber over one's head at the moment of a doomed charge. Yet they had the kind of spirit that a 24-year-old writes about in his diary when he says he will reach for his sword when the tanks are gone. That spirit was real. That courage was genuine. And it was not enough. Not against physics, not against the Monroe effect, not against a free people that had looked at the problem of tank armor in 1942 and solved it with a steel tube and an electrical trigger and an assembly line that produced 800,000 of them. Among the many American soldiers and Marines who carried the bazooka into combat in the Pacific, one name appears in the records of Iwo Jima with a particular, painful clarity. Platoon Sergeant Joseph R. Julian of Sturbridge, Massachusetts, serving with the 5th Marine Division on March 9th. 1945, the 19th day of the battle for that volcanic island, conducted a series of single-handed assaults against Japanese fortified positions that had pinned his unit in place and were draining it of men. He moved forward with his bazooka and with hand grenades, engaging bunkers that were immune to conventional infantry approach, crossing ground that was covered by Japanese fire, killing machine gun positions and pillbox emplacements in sequence. He was killed in action that day. He was 21 years old. He was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. His citation, preserved in the records of the Marine Corps, describes actions that were above and beyond the call of duty. His parents received the medal from the Secretary of the Navy in November 1945. What the citation cannot fully convey, and what no citation ever fully conveys, is the particular loneliness of a man moving forward alone with a steel tube on his shoulder toward positions that have been killing his companions for 19 days. It cannot convey the physics of the decision, the calculation, made in a fraction of a second in conditions of extreme physical danger, that the shaped charge in the nose of the rocket he is carrying is more powerful than the steel of the fortification ahead of him, and that his task is simply to close the distance to the point where that physical fact can be expressed. Julian believed in the weapon. He believed it because it worked. He had seen it work. And he carried it toward a fortified position on Iwo Jima, in the same spirit in which the Marines on Saipan had turned their bazookas on Goto's tanks. Not from blind conviction that the weapon would protect him, but from documented, empirically grounded confidence that the weapon would penetrate what it was aimed at. That is a different kind of faith. It is a faith rooted in the observable world. By July 9, 1944, Saipan was in American hands. The Japanese had suffered between 23,000 and 24,000 dead, soldiers, sailors, and civilians. American casualties amounted to more than 3,400 killed and over 13,000 wounded, for a total exceeding 16,500. The price was severe. The prize was the airfield. Within months of the island's capture, as the rebuilt and expanded Eslido Field, renamed Isley Field in honor of a Navy commander killed in the battle, was receiving B-29 Superfortress bombers at a rate that made the strategic bombardment of the Japanese home islands not merely possible, but systematic. The first B-29 raids launched from Saipan struck Truk in September 1944. By early 1945, the bombers were hitting Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and every major Japanese industrial center, burning out the factories that might, in another war, in another decade, under different assumptions, have produced the heavier, better armored tanks that the Japanese military establishment had always promised itself it would build when the time was right. The time was never right. The tanks were never built. The armor remained at 25 millimeters. The bazooka remained at 100 millimeters of penetration. But the gap between those two numbers, 75 millimeters of uncrossable physical reality, was also, in the end, the gap between the civilizations that produced them. After the battle, an American intelligence officer interrogated a Japanese prisoner, a survivor of the tank regiment's reduction. The prisoner's reaction, as translated and recorded in the after-action assessment, expressed a particular quality of incomprehension that was not purely about the bazooka. It was about the volume. The Marine positions had so many weapons, the prisoner said. Not one kind of weapon. Many kinds, all at once. He had not imagined that infantry positions could contain that density of anti-tank capability, that a handful of foxholes could face 44 tanks and destroy 31 of them before dawn because every platoon carried a bazooka team, and every battalion had its 37mm guns, every regiment had its 75mm pack howitzers, and the sea behind the American lines was stocked with warships carrying 5-inch guns calibrated to fire star shells and then, when the star shells had done their work of illumination, to fire high-explosive rounds at whatever the light had revealed. He had been trained to believe that armor was protection. What he discovered instead was that, in the American way of war, the infantry foxhole was not a position of weakness waiting for armored support to arrive. It was a position of layered, redundant industrial killing power that could defeat armor because it was equipped, supplied, and organized by a nation that had decided to apply its full economic and technological capacity to the problem of defeating every weapon the enemy possessed. Was not just some of them. All of them. From any angle. The last of the burning wrecks on the Saipan plain were still smoldering when the dawn patrols moved out to assess the damage. Young Marines in dungarees picked their way between the hulks, noting the penetrations in the steel, some small and precise, the fingerprint of a shaped charge, others larger where heavier ordnance had struck and torn. Several of the Chihas had been hit so many times that the original geometry of the vehicle was no longer fully recognizable. What remained was roughly the shape of a tank, the dimensions of a tank, the engine block and track assembly, and the gun that could no longer traverse, but emptied, hollowed, so the space that had contained 4 men, now blackened and silent in the way that only a space made for a human being and then violently unmade can be silent. One Marine, walking the field, found a tin can lying beside a burned Chiha, his own sea ration tin, discarded before the fight. It lay in the volcanic soil within arm's reach of the tank's blown tread assembly, its stenciled label still legible in the morning light. It was smaller than the tank by several orders of magnitude. It weighed a few ounces. It represented nothing of military significance in itself. But it had been produced by the same civilization that had produced the bazooka and the star shell and the destroyer offshore and the fleet of transports beyond the reef. The same civilization that had asked a question in 1942 and answered it with physics and factories and the kind of institutional confidence that comes from knowing, at the civilizational level, that your system can outproduce, outarm, and outsustain any opponent it is asked to defeat. The can lay in the red dirt beside the burned tank. The morning light fell on both of them equally. One of them was cold and inert. One of them represented something that was already halfway across the ocean, already loaded on another transport, already part of the next supply run to the next island in the chain of islands that led, in the inexorable logic of the American Pacific strategy, all the way to Tokyo Bay. There is a larger truth buried in the night of June 17, 1944. Beneath the burned iron and the volcanic soil of a small island most Americans had never heard of 6 months before their sons landed on its beaches. It is a truth not about tanks or bazookas specifically, though the tanks and the bazookas are where it becomes visible. It is a truth about what a civilization chooses to invest in, and what it assumes, and what assumptions are permitted to persist when the evidence contradicts them. The Chi-Ha was built on the assumption that spirit compensates for steel, that a nation of warriors trained to endure, willing to die, committed to a code older than the machine age, yet could close the material gap between itself and a fully industrialized opponent through the force of individual and collective sacrifice. That ideology, weaponized and deployed across the Pacific, sent 4 men at a time into a 13.5-ton machine with 25 millimeters of armor and told them it was enough. It was not enough. It had never been enough against an enemy that had spent 1942 figuring out that a shaped charge in a 2.5-pound rocket warhead could penetrate 4 inches of plate regardless of angle, and had then spent 1943 and 1944 manufacturing 800,000 of the launcher systems needed to put that answer in the hands of every Marine in every foxhole on every island. Freedom. The kind of freedom that permits a nation to organize its economic life around individual incentive, to reward the engineer who solves a problem, as to let the market price the materials needed to build the solution, to trust the factory worker with enough autonomy to maintain the production rate required to win. That freedom is not merely a moral good, it is a material advantage. It produces weapons, it produces supply chains, it produces the sea ration tin that reaches the soldier in the foxhole the same way the bazooka does, not because someone commanded that it would, but because the system it emerges from is organized around the principle that the soldier is worth sustaining, that the citizen in uniform carries, by right of his membership in the polity, a claim on all the material resources that the civilization can bring to bear on his survival and his victory. Yes, the 24-year-old Japanese tanker, who resolved to fight with his sword when the machines were gone, could not have written those words. His civilization had not given him the concept. His civilization had given him the sword. It had given him the code that said the spirit of the warrior was the decisive variable in any engagement, and that steel was only the container for that spirit, and that when the steel failed, the spirit would endure. His spirit endured, long enough to write in his diary, long enough to understand, in whatever terms his training permitted, that something had gone deeply and irreversibly wrong, but not long enough to know what it was, not long enough to see, from inside the logic that had built the Chi-Ha and sent it against the bazooka, yet that the gap between 25 millimeters and 100 millimeters of armor penetration was not a tactical problem with a tactical solution. It was the distance between 2 different answers to the oldest question a civilization can ask itself. What do we owe the man we send to fight? One civilization answered, a sword, a code, an ideology of sacrifice. The other answered, a tube, a shaped charge, a rocket, a supply chain, a ship full of replacement ammunition, a sea ration tin, an assembly line running 24 hours a day, everything, in other words, that a free people with sufficient industrial capacity and sufficient democratic conviction could produce and deliver to a soldier in a foxhole on an island in the Pacific, in the dark, before dawn, on the morning the tanks came. 31 burned hulks in the volcanic soil of Saipan answered the question before the sun came up. The answer has never changed.